The Milkmaid by Johannes Vermeer is one of the most popular works of genre painting, not only from the artist but from the Dutch golden age of the mid-1600s. It was the first work of art by Vermeer I ever learnt about back in art class in high school, and for over 10 years since then I've harbored the desire to make something out of this masterpiece. And so today I'll show you my process of painting my rendition of the Milkmaid, and at the end of the video I'll also highlight some features and techniques that Vermeer employed in his original artwork that you may not notice at a quick glance. But before then, let's see how my process will pan out. Like with most of my paintings, the first step here will be to draw a grid on the surface of the canvas. This is done using chalk, and the grey background on which I'm drawing is painted in acrylics. In a previous video I talked about the process that brings the canvas to this stage, so if interested you can check that out via the link in the description. In any case, I'm going to draw a similar grid on the reference image so that in the next step, in which I'll be using oil paints, I'll simply follow the way the main contours or the borderlines in different parts of the reference image interact with the grid, and so I'll be copying that onto the canvas. You'll also notice that in the part where I'm going to be painting her face, I've subdivided the grid into even smaller squares and rectangles. This is to increase the level of accuracy in that part of the painting. I normally do that for faces, hands and feet. These are usually the parts of a painting that you don't want to get wrong. But for all the other sections, I can be a bit more lenient. The oil paint I'm using in this case is mixed with a lot of solvent, and that's why the kind of lines it's drawing are very fluid, almost as fluid as those that a pen would make on paper. And the solvent I've used for this painting is tapenoid, and this is what I'm going to be using to increase the viscosity of the paint and also to clean the brushes when I need to. The reason why I drew the grid in chalk and painted the outlines in oil is so that when I'm done painting the outlines, I can very easily get rid of the chalk. And to do this, I'm simply going to wet one of the brushes with a bit of water and simply rub off the chalk from the surface of the canvas. The next step will be to create an underpainting, also known as a grisaille, and this is going to be a monochromatic or a one-color acrylic version of what the painting will eventually look like. And so by mixing a dark but not so dark acrylic color with gradually increasing amounts of white, I'm able to create a gradient that flows from dark to light. And this is going to be my color palette for the underpainting. Because this is acrylic, it's going to dry relatively quickly, which means in this particular session I'll have to mix these colors afresh at least a couple of times. And for the same reason, I'll cover the paint that I won't be using at this stage. I normally create another painting by exhausting one color before moving on to the next. And this can be in any order, so in this case I've started with the darkest one, and after this I'm gonna move on to the brightest one, then keep changing from shade to shade until I've covered all the sections of a face. Then I'll do the same for the rest of the painting. For acrylics, I normally use a set of relatively rough brushes because this step normally involves a lot of friction, which can be quite harmful to an otherwise softer brush like the ones used with oils. And the reason why I paint the underpainting in acrylics is because acrylics dry really fast, which means when I'm done with this stage, I'll be able to move on to the final oil layers immediately. Since the purpose of the underpainting is to simply guide the next stage, I don't have to be as smooth or as accurate in my blending as I'll have to be in the oil painting stage. And so even though I try to blend them anyway, for the ones which I can't, because acrylics again dries so fast that it's almost impossible to completely blend them together, I just leave them as blocks and this won't cause any problem. The main point of this stage is to focus on the contrast, and other details like textures will come in later with oil paints. You may also notice that in this case I've painted the background last, which is the inverse of how I normally do it with oils later on. This is because in the underpainting stage I like to focus on the main character or characters first, then work the background around them and not the other way around. Also in the underpainting stage, at least the way I do it, I don't have background to foreground overlaps, and I'll explain this better in the next stage, but that's one of the reasons why I don't have to start with the background in the underpainting. With that stage done, now it's time to move on to the final layer, which I'm going to paint using oils. I'll start this by mixing all the colors that I'll use to paint the wall in the background, and thankfully, unlike with acrylics, I won't have to remix these colors every couple of hours because oil paints take a relatively longer time to dry, could be 2 or 3 days. This is now the stage that will eventually make this an oil painting, and the way I like to do this is I start with the background or the parts of the painting that is visually farthest away from us, and for this particular painting it has to be the wall. So the wall will come first, followed by the curtain in front of it, then the plants behind the model, then the model herself. With oil paints, I'm also going to blend in all these colors, and so after painting in, say for the wall, the 2 shades of cream, I'm going to blend them in using the same brush so that the transition from the lighter to the darker version of it is so smooth that it's nearly impossible to decipher. Also, thanks to the slow drying speed of oil paints, I could even take hours to create the cloudiest transitions when needed. Of course, with oil paints, I'm using softer brushes now. And one more thing is I am not mixing the paint with any solvent or medium at this stage because I don't want it to be too viscous, as that would make blending a bit more difficult. Now that the background, which in this case is the wall, is completely done, I can then move on to the curtain that's in front of it. When I was painting the wall, I allowed some of the paint to cross into the section where the curtain actually is, so that when I paint the outer borders of the curtain, there won't be a margin of negative space between the curtain and the wall. And so the curtain will appear as though it's actually in front of the wall and not like they're side by side. So that's the background to foreground overlap I was talking about that I didn't have to do in the previous layer, which was the underpainting, but in this layer, it's actually necessary. Like I did in the background, this time I can also place the colors next to each other, then simply blend them together. And then on top of that layer, I'll apply more paint, but in this case, I won't blend it into the layer underneath so that this layer appears more in focus. There doesn't have to be a particular order in the way the colors are placed, whether that means starting with the brightest or the darkest colors. And so in different parts of the painting, you'll see me changing up the order depending on which color I just used in the previous section so that I don't have to clean the brush all the time. But the one constant format is I generally tend to start with the biggest brushes first, then finish up with the smaller ones. One other good thing about the fact that oil paints take a long time to dry is that, of course, I can mix the colors on canvas. So I don't have to do all the mixing on my palette, which would obviously need me to mix a countless number of different colors. But if I have a small array of the main colors that appear on the surface of the artwork, I can either create different hues and different shades and tints on canvas with those colors, or even introduce new pure colors onto the surface of the painting, and that way end up creating colors that don't appear on the palette. One advantage of mixing the colors on canvas this way is that if I start with a local color or a background color of a particular hue, so let's say I'm painting the brown table or the cream curtain, when I then add shadows or highlights on top of that color before it dries, they end up mixing with that color, so they look like derivatives of it and not as alien colors that have nothing to do with it. So if the surface that I'm painting on was red, for instance, and I add white, the white will end up looking like pink because that's what you get when you mix red and white. And if it was blue, then I would have highlights that appear light blue and not pure white, which is also the way light behaves in real life. So back to the palette I go, and this time I'll be mixing up the colors of the houseplant behind our model. It's a simple palette, so this time I'm gonna need a gradient of maybe 5 or 6 shades and tints of green. Here again, you can see the advantage of 1, having started with the background, and 2, letting the background overlap into the section where the leaves are going to be. This is why when I paint these leaves and branches, they appear as though they are actually in front of the wall. If I did it the other way around, in other words, if I started with the leaves first, then had to paint the background in between the spaces between the leaves, the blending of the background wouldn't be as smooth or as seamless as it is. So you can imagine it like if you're painting a tree that has a sky as the background behind it, you want to start with the sky first, then the leaves of the tree on top of the sky. And of course, you want to do this when the background is dry. So if I was painting these leaves before the cream background was fully dry, then what would happen is that the colors of the leaves and the twigs would blend in with the color of the background, which in the previous section I actually needed when I was painting the curtain and the table, but this time I don't, because these 2 sections of the painting, the wall behind and the plant in front, are individual sections of the artwork that have nothing to do with each other, and so I don't need the colors to blend into one another. That's why I had to wait for the background to completely dry so that now when I paint the leaves, the colors are not impurified by that of the background. Other times, depending on what's around an object in the painting, you may see some odd reflections or some odd colors that are not part of the original or the local color. So in this case, the leaves are green, but you can see I'm applying yellow or orange or yellow ochre highlights. Aside from some of these colors being discolorations of the chlorophyll in the leaves, they could also be reflections of objects around this plant. And now I'm going to mix up a different hue of green, which is going to give us a very vibrantly colored skirt. And for this skirt, I've decided to start with the main shadows, although even after painting the local color and blending it in for the first layer, I'm still going to come back and paint more detailed shadows, because the skirt, just like the rest of the model, is in full focus, and so we'll be able to see a lot more detail than we did in the wall, for instance. When it's time to paint the portrait, I'm going to start with a new layer of outlines. I didn't do this for the other parts because they're not as critical as the face is. And if you remember, when I started with the grids in the very first stage of the painting, I had added extra boxes or extra rectangles for the section where the face is. These measures are informed by the same logic, which is when painting a portrait, the face and to a lesser degree the hands and legs, or even more accurately the fingers and toes, are the critical areas which you don't want to get wrong, or at least I don't want to get them wrong. This doesn't mean I don't paint the other sections of the painting with caution. It's just that I tend to give the face an extra and possibly obsessive level of concentration. And so once again, we're back to a very similar process to the way I painted the underpainting, except in this case, instead of using different shades and tints of one color, I'm using many different colors that I've just mixed to simulate the different skin tones and levels of lighting across the model's face. And so after placing all these colors side by side into something that looks almost like a vector painting, I then come in with a soft and clean brush that has no solvent at all to try and blend them in so the borders between different colors don't look as crisp or as clear as they do now. When it comes to the hair, it's a much simpler affair because most of it happens to be incredibly dark, at least in this painting. And so after using a large followed by a medium brush, I'll then use a smaller but not too small brush to create the individual hairs or the tufts of hair that will appear to be sticking out of the afro. I'll then use another soft clean brush to smoothen whatever borders are still visible in the section of the hair. And when this is done, the face will be over and done with, and so it will be time to replicate this entire process onto all the other parts of exposed skin. I understand that the colors I'm using appear excessively vibrant, and this is a deliberate tactic I was using because I wanted the painting to have an incredibly warm feel. And so in this painting I'm mixing nearly every warm color that I'm using with some yellow, just so it appears as though it's almost glowing. I'm going to hold off on painting her left arm right now because being right-handed, it will be difficult to paint the section of her top that's closest to that arm if the arm is fully painted. Just like I did with the background and the plants, I'm gonna need the colors of the top to just ever so slightly encroach into the section of the arm so that when I paint the arm on top of it, it won't leave a margin between the arm and the top. And for the top, the first pass is simply focused on laying in the colors with no attention to detail at this moment. And when I'm done using this brush to do that, I'll then come in with smaller brushes to make it as detailed and as much in focus as the rest of the Milkmaid is. Now, I don't know if this is as clear to you as it is to me, but you can see that in the left side of the top, very close to her bicep, the shadowed section of the top has just slightly eaten into where the hand is going to be. And this is why when I paint the hand on top of it, the hand will actually appear as though it's in front. And so after blending this in with a soft brush, now it's time to paint the jug or the pitcher from which she'll be pouring the liquid. And of course, in front of the jug, this time there's a basket, so I'm going to paint its handle. And even though it's in front of the model, it's actually blurred just as much as the background was blurred, because in this case, the camera and the viewer's eye is focused on the Milkmaid herself. I've added some colorful flowers onto this basket in front, but of course, because of the blurry nature of this section of the painting, they're going to appear as simple blocks of color, although after painting them, you'll be able to easily make out what they are. The other objects on the table are painted with the same amount of detail, which isn't much to speak of compared with the details in, say, the skirt. But I do enjoy playing around with blind focus across different parts of a painting because it tends to dramatize the distance between the different elements in the painting itself and, of course, between the viewer and those parts of the painting. Blurring is also something that not only cameras but the human eye also does, even though we do it most of the time subconsciously, be it sections of your view that are in your peripheral vision, or if you're looking in a concentrated way at something that's close to your eye and consequently whatever is behind it appears blurred and vice versa. But the beauty of painting is that in different parts of the process, be it during shooting, during editing, or actually painting, as you can see, I'm able to play around with this blind focus effect. And so sometimes it does look unrealistic, but the ability to decide what sections of the painting should display a lot or a little amount of detail allows for some interesting visual effects and can also aid in the narrative aspect of the painting. And so after painting the yellow cloth crumpled on the table, again just for a pop of color, I'm then gonna move on to paint the bowl or the receptacle of the liquid. And since the bowl is much closer to the model than the flowers are, it's going to be relatively more in focus, although not as much as the model behind it. Next come the drops or the stream of water being carefully poured from the jug above. And after highlighting this with white and somewhat blurred dots, I'll then go back to the top and paint the earrings dangling from the model's ear. The reason why I didn't paint this earlier is because when painting something as detailed as this, I like to have a place to place my hand on, but since the colors of the face hadn't dried yet, I couldn't do that. But now that I've spent days painting the rest of the model and the table in front of her, the face is now dry enough that I can place my hand on it without damaging or smudging any of the paint. The second earring is in shadow because it's eclipsed by the model's head, and so we won't see as much detail in it as we did the one on her right ear. And after painting the necklace in a similar way, it's now time to unveil my rendition of the Milkmaid. My painting measures 170 by 100 centimeters and took approximately 7 days to create. When placed side by side with Vermeer's, it's easier to appreciate the differences and similarities between these two. The most glaring difference, of course, being that one is a world-famous tourist attraction, whereas the other is a mimicry. But all jokes aside, let me talk about a few things that I like about Vermeer's original. Aside from the generally simple and quiet nature of the scene, the masterful separation of warm colors on the upper section or the upper half of the scene, so these are the yellows and the oranges and the browns, to the cooler colors, in this case the blues, on the bottom half of the painting, has always kind of stood out to me, such that I always feel like I can separate the painting into the yellow section and the blue section. Zooming into this painting, however, reveals a lot more interesting details that you may not catch at first sight. A couple of personal favorites, of course, being the unfiltered light streaking in from the cracked window pane, the almost hyper-realistic level of detail paid to the holes and cracks on the wall, and the smooth transition halfway through her left arm that separates the tanned part of her wrist from the section that was covered right before she rolled up her sleeves to start pouring the milk into the Dutch oven. Moving slightly lower, you can see on the pieces of bread on the table the technique he used, which we now call pointillism, of painting each crumb of bread using dots, except in Vermeer's case, he does it such that the bread appears to be glittering. He also has an interesting way of using pointilles or dots of different colors in places where they visually don't make a lot of sense. So an example of that would be these blue dots on the lip and the sides of the receptacle into which the milkmaid is pouring the milk, which seem to be reflecting blue light from nowhere because the blue elements in the painting, namely the skirt and the dark blue jug to the other side, are neither in front nor above this utensil. So it appears to be a personalized technique that's unique to Vermeer, and of course you can also see these blue dots even on the stale piece of bread. To be able to achieve all this in a painting as small as the Milkmaid is, because the Milkmaid is 46 by 41 centimeters, is a feat that most artists, myself included, would actually struggle to achieve. But it's only one of the many things that make this incredible artwork and, by extension, this incredible artist stand out. And with that said, I hope you've enjoyed this process, or at least it's reminded you of an artist you probably weren't thinking about. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.